The discovery and publication of the Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of 12 or 13, depending on how you want to count them, volumes of mostly Gnostic Christian texts compiled roughly in the 4th century, though discovered in the mid-20th century, revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity. From the mysterious sayings of Jesus and a Q-like Gospel of Thomas, the gender-bending paradoxes of Thunder Perfect Mind, the highly technical Platonic Sethian world of Zostrianos, and the myths of the fall of Sophia and the creation and domination of the physical cosmos, all around you by the misshapen Demiurge, Yald Bauth, and the Apocryphon of John, the text found at Nag Hammadi truly represented a sea change in our understanding of even what early Christianity was, profoundly revealing the existence of Christianities with a wide range of beliefs and practices. However, these important texts were not the first ancient Gnostic scriptures to arrive in modern Europe. As early as the mid-18th century, the first Gnostic volumes made their way to England. These early collections testified to an otherwise utterly unknown form of Christian Gnosticism, one deeply rooted in ancient Egyptian religious conceptions of the cosmos, where the soul must ascend in a perilous post-mortem journey through the spheres of the visible and invisible cosmos to find an eternal home among the great stellar treasuries of the heavens. The volumes contain the magical seals, signs, heavenly maps, rituals, and ciphers by which one makes this journey through a cosmos emanated by the mysterious true God, as those texts have it, known only as you, all revealed by the resurrected Jesus to his male and female disciples. Let's explore the text now known to scholars as the two Books of Jeu, handbooks for the mystical journey of the soul to stellar eternity. If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my other content on topics in esotericism, including curated playlists. Also, if you want to support this work of providing accessible, scholarly, long-form, and, I guess importantly, free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting my work by taking a look at my Patreon, by considering a one-time donation to the channel, maybe picking up some merch over at the store tab, or with the super thanks option that you can find there below the video. But now, let's turn to the Books of Jeu and the ascent of the soul to the eternal treasuries of light. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Now, before diving into this incredibly amazing and profoundly difficult text, I'll be pointing you to the conversations I recently had with Drs. Aaron Evans Walker, author of one of the shockingly few studies of the Books of Jeu and Jungian Gnosticism, as we introduce some of the more important features of these texts and the community that perhaps produced them, and do a little bit of healthy speculation about just what's going on in these very odd books. But as I mentioned in the introduction, the first Gnostic text reached modern European scholars beginning in the mid-18th century. The British explorer James Bruce purchased the Codex that would eventually bear his name in January of 1769 near Medinet Habu. The exact nature of the discovery of the text is mysterious. It's probably the result of tomb raiding, like virtually all such textual discoveries that have made in the 20th century, including the Nag Hammadi Library. This collection contained the Books of Jeu, the subject of today's episode, along with other fragmentary hymns and what is now known as the Untitled Treatise, because we didn't try very hard with that one, did we? A bit later, the British Library also acquired what is now known as the Ascent Codex in 1785. Its origins, aside from the fact that it very likely came from Egypt, are utterly mysterious. I mean, we don't even know how it ended up in England. at all. It just shows up in the 18th century. The Ascent Codex contains the monumental and even more difficult Pistis Sophia, along with another Gnostic text. What's conspicuous about these two volumes is that both of them seem to be testimonies to a faith forgotten, as the Theosophist scholar G.R.S. Mead had it, a really lovely turn of phrase. Specifically, they are both scriptural attestations to a form of otherwise unknown quasi-Christian Gnosticism, only quasi-Christian Gnosticism. Scholars that now refer to it as Aeon, after the cosmocrator, or the central demiurgic being, found in both those texts, the true, though not highest God, Jeu, J-E-U, in the way that it's written out. In this episode, I'm going to be focusing on the earlier compositions of the two, that is to say, the Books of Jeu, found in the Bruce Codex, saving the enormously intimidating and complex Pistis Sophia for a future episode when I get up the courage to do that. Finally, it's also worth mentioning that despite being the earliest Gnostic text to arrive in modern Europe, these texts remain, ironically, among the least studied by scholars. They're even actively maligned, or they were actively maligned, as degenerate, Gnosticism run wild, merely stereotyped, or somehow otherwise utterly unworthy of study compared to other Gnostic texts like the Apocryphon of John or the Gospel of Thomas, which have numerous lengthy monographs about them. There is one monograph about this text in English. For whatever reason, scholarship is just biased against the Books of Jeu and the Pistis Sophia. I'll have some guesses about why I think they're biased in that way in just a little bit, but now let's turn to the Books of Jeu, our most complete and yet somehow most understudied manuals of mystical ascent from the ancient world. Yeah, they're also the most complete manuals of mystical ascent in the ancient world, making it even more mind-boggling why they're not more studied. As I mentioned, the Books of Jeu are contained in the Bruce Codex, published in 1769, though the dating of the Codex is still under dispute, probably 4th or 5th century CE, although the texts themselves are much earlier. Further, the Codex is in a very poor state of conservation and was so from the beginning of its modern acquisition. It's composed of 78 papyrus leaves, of which there are about 156 pages, some of which just went missing since it got purchased by Bruce. Even the original leather cover that bound it all together, it also just vanished. When it was acquired by the British Library, the Codex was actually consisting just of not even connected leaves, which were then haphazardly bound in 1886. And I say haphazardly, what I mean is there was no attempt to order the pages, to separate between verso and recto, not even to put them the right side up. Some of them are just flipped upside down and bounded together. And at that time, each leaf was actually bound between two sheets of tracing paper, rendering contemporary codicological study virtually impossible or very difficult. I don't think it's even been carbon dated yet. Contemporary photos of the state of the Codex reveal that it is basically now worn to the point of illegibility and marred by mildew, because humid England is not bone-dry Egypt. Luckily, transcripts and some early photos were also made of the text, which make it a bit easier for scholars to work with the manuscript. Despite these travails of this poor manuscript, scholars have reconstructed what they generally take to be the original order of the Codex, though not without some disagreement among specialists because, I don't know, truth and job security. The title, The Two Books of Jeu, are not original to the manuscript. The closest thing we can get to a title for either of these books is found at the very end of 1 Jeu, where it seems to call itself the Book of the Great Logos, corresponding to the Mysteries, which is a lot cooler than the Book of Jeu, with the later Pistis Sophia of the Ascent Codex providing the name that scholars now use, and most scholars agree that the Pistis Sophia probably is referring to the books that we now have that we refer to as 1 and 2nd Jeu. Further, as we'll see, even the Books of Jeu as we have them are probably largely incomplete, sadly, with long sections of the treasury maps and the quasi-magical techniques for bypassing their archonic and their celestial guardians largely missing now. The two books may also be made up of smaller literary units, microforms edited together over time, and the cosmology really does show signs of becoming increasingly stratified, perhaps as communal speculation developed as the community began to do these mystical ascents, perhaps. In fact, by the later Pistis Sophia, the cosmology has positively ballooned in scale and stratifications. Even between the first and second books of Jeu, there are clearly developments which complicate any simple presentation of the cosmos imagined in those texts. And I'll be really honest here, I've avoided making this episode precisely because this text is just so technically complicated. Oversimplifying it to make it accessible doesn't seem to really give it justice, but also just telling people it's impossible to summarize, so you should just go dive into what is an absolutely intimidating text, also seems to be shirking the real responsibility of this channel, making texts and traditions that are admittedly very difficult and obscure accessible to the public for further study and inspiration for you to go dive into it. So I'm going to hazard this episode, and as you study the text on your own, which I hope you'll do, you'll forgive my shortcomings in this episode because I'm necessarily going to be simplifying things. But I hope this episode does inspire you to go study the text, even if, especially because scholarly bias against it might have otherwise made it obscure to you. You might not even know that it exists, and so let's go do the damn thing. The first book begins, oddly enough, with 2 copies of the same introduction, neither of which may have been original to the ur-text of 1 Jeu. We find the resurrected Jesus in a dialogue with his apostles, the only time the term apostles typically is used, where he's urging them to crucify the world so that it doesn't crucify them. He would know a thing or two about that. And on the secret knowledge that will save them from the evil ruler or the archon of this aeon or age. Specifically, their task is to learn this knowledge in order to pull their souls up to the eternal realm of goodness following their physical deaths, but also to pull the realm of heaven down onto earth. A really interesting idea, perhaps through the spreading of this salvific knowledge or gnosis to the elect by ritual initiation, purification, and then the transmission of these secrets for transversing the cosmos on the way to eternity. Following a lacuna, or a gap in the text, the living Jesus, as he's called, begins to reveal the secret structure of the cosmos and the means by which the soul can traverse it. And, in a sense, that's the totality of the Books of Jeu. Thanks, everybody. You smash buttons and Patreon, and I'll see y'all next time for more esoterica. Yeah, no. From here, Jesus begins to reveal how his Father, the utterly unknowable, unattainable God, moved you, the star of the episode, who the text refers to as the true God, to begin the process of emanating reality itself, specifically a series of what the text calls Treasuries of Light. Then we're shown a series of what the text calls types, or really they're illustrations of this emanatory process. Did I mention that the Books of Jeu are the only illustrated Gnostic books that survive? So that's kind of awesome, kind of rad. Depicting the very true first God, Jeu, as at least types upon his face in various states of pre- and post-emanation. This process involves the emanations of 3 linear voices of praise, but also a kind of inner radiation from the unknowable Father of the small idea through Jeu. This radiation of the small idea, we're not really told what the small idea is, along with the 3 voices, perhaps linear and circular geometric forms, maybe representing circular spirit and linear matter, as G.R.S. Mead has it, seem to be the substance by which the first concrete ontological structures are composed, a kind of chamber in which dwells the true God Jeu, and from which all reality will further emanate in concentric nested structures, which the text calls the Treasuries of Light. However, the second structure is actually populated with the first emanated beings, the so-called Watchers, which secure and guard the gates to and from each treasury. With the first treasuries of primal Jeu complete, the text now begins the painstaking process of describing the next 26 such treasury emanations. While each one is a bit different, we can give a general sketch of what each entails. Each of them is centered on a specific emanation of Jeu as a kind of particular Jeu being, each with a slightly different name, ending in U, unsurprisingly, probably as a kind of theonym. Below them is a root of the places of the father of the treasury, of which the primal one seems to have been emanated in the first flowing out of the voices and the little idea. A given U emanation is surrounded by a series of veils demarcated by a series of little alphas in the text. Later instructions are provided for how to part these veils and pass through a given emanatory level on the way to the true realm of the final eternity. The final eternity is given first, and they kind of go out from there. Beneath a given treasury map, the U emanation of that layer of reality is providing a character, a kind of quasi-magical sign or seal for that U being at that level of that treasury. Finally, each treasury is occupied typically by around 12 emanations. Maybe there's something akin to angelic guardians, of which 3 are denoted as guarding the threefold gates that one passes into that treasury, and out of which one passes on the way out of that treasury. These watchers, as they're named, typically and otherwise unknown nomina barbara, although there seems to be a preference for the Z sound, Z, in their names. Some of these emanatory beings are called Zazazoi, Zeoi, Oozai, Zazoi, Zezoaz, etc. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing their names correctly, sorry, watchers, giving them a kind of buzzing-like connotation. Of course, knowing the names of these beings is part and parcel of being able to magically bind them and bypass them as one's soul climbs up to eternity. The use of these characters of the U being and these quasi-magical watcher names place the Book of U well within the practice of the world of Greco-Egyptian magic, and if you've ever studied much in the way of the Greek magical papyri, you'll see a lot of similarities here, and that's going to be even clearer as we proceed. Finally, there seems to be a relatively clear parallel with the structures of the treasuries of the world of light and their guardians with the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or better, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. That text, or really a genre of literature, is a series of complex spells for similarly guiding the soul to the realm of Osiris to dwell in eternity. A part of that travel ordeal is actually bypassing various regions of the underworld populated by various kinds of guardians, sometimes named and often coming in threes. So that's a pretty clear parallel between the Books of U and the Books of Coming Forth by Day. Though we don't typically have visual descriptions or depictions of them in the Books of U, they're just named, and the names in the Books of U don't track to the names in the spells of the Book of Coming Forth by Day, yet these parallels with indigenous Egyptian religion and others, we'll see more with astrology in just a moment, are significantly conspicuous in my mind. Sadly, again, the text breaks off, but it was probably the case that the original text contained all 60 treasury maps. The number 60 here is a relatively odd cosmological number, unattested in virtually any other Gnostic text, where multiples of 7 or 365, along with various other numbers, tend to dominate. The first Book of U also mentions mysteriously various ranks of fatherhood around the various treasuries. Specifically, 5 ranks of fatherhood in the middle, which are in the places of the god, who is in the midst of them all. These mentions of divisions of 5 are strange to square with the text. The Coptic term for middle there, mite, has a technical, specifically astrological connotation for the astral ecliptic, the band of the sky along which the wandering stars, better known as the planets, move about. Further, it seems that the 60 treasuries are also grouped in sections of 5 astrological circles of the Arctic, the Summer Tropic, the Equator, the Winter Tropic, and the Antarctic Circle. Among these 60 treasuries, perhaps the fixed stars are the constellations moving along these 5 astral planes, perhaps somehow related to the Egyptian system of the deacons, and there's another obscure mention of the emanation of a further 5 trees in the text. This might be a Manichaean reference, actually, corresponding to the 5 planetary objects which move through the mite, or the astral ecliptic. This would leave the 2 primal U emanations, the ones at the very beginning, perhaps corresponding to the sun and the moon, respectively. There's actually reasons to believe that from the text and from Pistis Sophia. Thus, if all this obtains, the first Book of U is not only describing the emanation of the metaphysical world, but also simultaneously describing a vast astral map of the known cosmos, literally guiding the soul up through the entirety of the stellar planes to find their eternal home among the fixed stars, or perhaps just beyond them. This is a rather fitting place in the context of the more ancient Egyptian worldview, where a similar fate was actually hoped for as early as the pharaohs in the pyramid texts, and as the afterlife were more democratized, as we have it in the coffin text and then the books of Coming Forth by Day, or the books of the dead, the righteous dead for all classes could go dwell in the bark of the millions in the stars. Here, a stellar afterlife in the Book of Jeu seems to be the goal, thus further linking it with its indigenous Egyptian context. Following that break, we have a fragmentary hymn praising the primal mystery for the series of emanations. And while it might be clear enough up at this point, it's worth noticing that the Books of Jeu, they don't hold on to the kind of hard dualism that we find in some other texts like it. While some regions of this cosmos will be dominated by malevolent archons, as we'll see in just a bit, the post-mortem journey from the Earth to the stars isn't an escape from a physical world as a prison created by an evil, ignorant Demiurge, so much as the hopeful journey from a lower temporal existence to a higher eternal one. Thus, the Books of Jeu never have so much of a cosmic tragedy narrative such as found in the Sethian literature, or to a lesser extent the Valentinian literature. And after this break in the text, it picks back up with Jesus revealing more secrets, of course, for transversing the treasuries mapped out earlier. Here, only the 56th through the 60th itineraries are actually preserved, only 4, typically involving various seals, names to be recited, ciphers which are held in the hand and written, perhaps on stones or gems, it's hard to say, to be used in the process of drawing back the gate watchers and pulling back the ranks and the veils so that each treasury can be crossed on the way to stellar eternity in the presence of the true God. Here the text is conspicuously like the text of Jewish Merkava mysticism, where the descenders in that text, the descenders to the divine throne, must pass through various hechalot, or palaces, on their way to the innermost throne room of the divine, employing a pretty similar system of passcodes and divine names, though there isn't a clear direct connection, and perhaps ascending or descending out of the cosmos was just a shared experience for a number of different communities during this time. It could just be the case that lots of people wanted to escape this 4th century, 5th century world. In a sense, these sections of the first book of Jeu stand on their own and may have been the totality of this literature in the early periods of its communal production. It reveals the truth about the post-mortem journey, it reveals the nature of the celestial treasuries that one must traverse, it maps them out for you, and it finally presents the instructions to make just that journey using all those seals and ciphers and codes. However, the text continues, with the disciples questioning Jesus about, why all this exists in the first place. Damn good question, if you ask me. Good job, disciples. Why is all this like this? Why 60 treasuries? The answer that Jesus provides is anything but clear, but it involves the flow of the little idea which somehow radiated out of the unattainable Father. That first emanation of the little idea became nothing less than Jesus himself. Then the 3 voices which somehow go on to constitute the cosmos as we know it. It appears that, although this is a bit of speculation on my part, that the cosmos may appear baroque and overly complicated to us, but that was simply the necessary nature by which it had to be. Things simply flowed out in the way that they were meant to be. Thus, Jesus basically recounts the narrative toward the beginning of the text that we just encountered. However, Jesus does comfort the disciples that while all this might seem really complicated, and it is, that he will personally guide them through the astral zones towards eternity, acting as a kind of tour guide, shaman Jesus. Further, the disciples continue to be reasonable and ask for a kind of, cheat code to bypass all the powers of the treasuries. Rather than memorizing all 60 different codes, why not just one code to rule them all? And, Jesus kind of gives it to them. One great name, seal, and cipher, which kind of hacks the whole system, I guess, allowing them to waltz through the treasuries to the palace of the true God, just outside of that of the unattainable Father. Though it does admittedly come with a bunch of pretty dire warnings about using it, so hack carefully. Finally, concluding the first book is a hymn of praise for having guided himself and the disciples through the seventh treasury. Only 53 more to go. After that hymn, the text concludes with the title, The Great Logos Corresponding to the Mysteries. The title typically comes at the end of these Gnostic Coptic manuscripts. As I mentioned, the first and earliest Book of Jeu is basically a self-contained soteriological, literary, and ritual unit, complete with the earliest emanations from the unattainable Father, the treasury of the true God, the goal of the soul's post-mortem ascent through the various 60 treasuries, and the corresponding 60 techniques or 60 magical practices for transversing them. Though most of them in the manuscript, again as we have it, have been lost, though we do have the great cheat code, the name of the great power, and the comfort to know that at least Jesus himself will act as the leader of this expedition on the way to eternity. Indeed, by the end of Jeu 1, they are all kind of very much on their way, and perhaps the reader was to take comfort that they too would progress with Jesus after death, using the Book of Jeu as a kind of guidebook, or something like the Book of Coming Forth by Day through the celestial realm. However, just as the first book comes to an end, the second begins, the second Book of Jeu, focusing not on transversing the upper treasuries of light, but the lower Aeonic world of the planetary spheres and the malevolent archons that dominate and seek to harm you on your way through at least some of those realms. The second book opens, rather than Jesus talking with the apostles, the text now opens with Jesus now addressing his male and female disciples, promising to provide them the mysteries of the treasuries of light, whose erasure of sin is necessary for them transversing them. While he'll provide these, he warns that they cannot be revealed to non-initiates and cannot be sold for worldly goods like gold and silver, as they could, end up in the hands of those who serve the evil archons. You don't want your secrets to end up in the archons' hands. However, prior to revealing those mysteries, which may have very well been those very mysteries that we were talking back just a moment ago in the first Book of Jeu, Jesus announces that the disciples must undergo a series of ritual purifications, specifically the baptisms of water, fire, the Holy Spirit, along with the fourth ritual, the mystery of removing the evil of the archons. A little overeager, the disciples seem dismayed that they haven't yet gotten the mysteries of the treasuries, but Jesus comforts them, noting that only with the mystery of the forgiveness of sins, another mystery, can they even begin their ascent to the upper treasuries, thus introducing a much more layered aspect of the Jungian cosmology, as we'll see in just a moment. However, after noting that they will become sons of the pleroma, or sons of the fullness, so basically a kind of becoming gods, or apotheosis in Gnostic terms, he details the series of baptisms and the mystery to remove the evil of the archons. Now, I've done an entire half-hour episode on just this part of the second Book of Jeu, the baptism rituals, which are utterly fascinating and which are some of the best preserved quasi-magical Gnostic rituals from antiquity. Now, you may want to pause here, check out that episode, because I'm not going to be covering the baptisms in this episode. You can check out that entire 30-minute episode and then come back for the full treatment of the second Book of Jeu. I'll wait. Well, welcome back. Or so you skipped the baptisms, huh? Okay, well, you do you, but you can't start up through the Aeons and with their meanie archons until you do the baptism, so just saying. But assuming you've secured the series of baptisms and the release from the evil of the archons ritual, which were probably a series of purifications and initiations, for which the second Book of Jeu may have operated as a kind of ritual manual, and which likely did not happen all at once. You didn't likely get all of those baptisms at once. Jesus promises now a further series of defenses. These are kind of mystical, magical means to pass the lower levels of the archons, specifically the hostile region of the first 5 Aeons, which, like the methods to pass the Watchers of the Treasuries, also requires seals, names, ciphers, and the manner of invoking their names or symbols in order to pass them or to cause them to withdraw to the west, as the text often has it. Thus, the second Book of Jeu begins to lay out the initial path of the ascent and the defenses against the various beings that inhabit these lower aeons. First, it appears that the soul mounts up from the earth in a post-mortem state, passing through 12 distinct aeons, the first 5 of which actually house the malevolent archons, which are actively hostile to the soul. These archons include the more famous classical Sethian beings such as Yaldabaoth in the 3rd aeon and Samael or Samelo in the 4th aeon, though one gets the sense that they've been sort of just kind of grafted onto the Jungian cosmology. They don't really fit very well. And they certainly aren't playing the role of evil Demiurge, and dismissing them or making them withdraw to the West actually isn't terribly difficult if you have the proper purifications, the proper mystery of the forgiveness of sins, and all of the various defenses, magical defenses, which you're supposed to have. Also, the mystery of the forgiveness of sins that Jesus keeps promising to provide the disciples, he never does. The text actually breaks off at the end and we never learn it, so good luck up in those aeons when you die. So, with the system of defenses in the form of the binding names, the seals, the ciphers, etc., we now begin to go up through the aeons. However, the 6th aeon is known as the Little Mist. The archons of the Little Mist actually have a little goodness in them, and they rejoice when you bypass them. They're happy to send you on your way. Thanks, archons of the Little Mist. After the 6th archon of the Little Mist, the others are also relatively neutral, and you can pass them without incident, assuming you have the mystery of the forgiveness of sins, the baptism, and all the defenses. These basically are neutral, as I said, in character until one reaches the 12th aeon, which is shockingly inhabited by none other than the Sethian primal divine trinity of the great invisible spirit, the Mother Barbelo, and the unbegotten God. One possible explanation for this is that, like Yaldabaoth and other archons, the Jungians just kind of grafted the Sethian trinity onto their system for some reason. Another more polemical read, Gnostic shade, is that this is an actually intentional act of demotion by the Jungians of the highest trinity in the Sethian system back down into the world of the planetary aeons. That's polemics. That's real Gnostic shade. To take your highest spiritual trinity and shove them back into the world of matter. Take that, you Sethians. Regardless, this Sethian region is also pretty easily bypassed, assuming all the things, before you come to the 13th aeon, which is a kind of liminal space, an in-between, a mesos in Greek actually, between the lower realms of the Aeons and the upper realm of the Treasuries. It's said to be inhabited by the great invisible God and his 24 emanations, one of which, by the way, will become the famed Pistis Sophia of that eponymous text, which we'll get to when I work up the bravery, along with the great virgin spirit. Again, there's lots going on in this other aeon, this mesos. Within the 13th aeon, or the mesos, is another subregion, a kind of 14th aeon inhabited by a second invisible god, though this actually might just be a corruption that snuck into the text. It might just be a duplication. But also here is a triple-powered gods, the triple-powered ones, another complex borrowing from the Platonizing Sethian tradition this time. But while this region is generally more hostile to the disciples than the previous planetary archons, this area is just jealous of the ability of the disciples to proceed to the 60 Treasuries of Light. The triple-powered gods, or the triple-powered ones, will themselves eventually merit salvation, Jesus tells the disciples, because they have faith, perhaps given their proximity to the treasuries, and will attain the mystery of the forgiveness of sin in their own time. So these are the only non-human beings among the archons that will seem to ultimately transcend their condition. The final defense is then provided to bypass the 13th, 14th aeon of the mesos, this in-between area, and a final group of beings called the Paralimptores are said to know you and receive you to themselves, perhaps to ferry you and the disciples across the Ionic realm, divided by the mesos, to the place of the right, the realm of the 60 treasuries of the first book of Jeu, though we'll never know because the text breaks off exactly here. So, in brief, you start at the Earth, your post-mortem travel through the 5 hostile sublunar aeons, and then up through the 7 more neutral planetary archons before reaching the complex Sethian 13th Aeon, then into the Mesos with the triple-powered gods, before reaching up to the 60 Treasuries of Light with its on Mite, or mist. Now, some of y'all out there might be wondering about the original reading that I gave of 1U as a kind of astrological star map. This is actually Evan Walker's position, and I agree with her. Well, how does that map on to second Book of Jeu? Well, it doesn't appear to. And it might just be that the earlier Egyptian astral eternity was eventually supplanted by a more Platonizing variant. It's hard to say, though I have to agree with Evans Walker, as I just mentioned. I really do buy her reading of 1U, or at least Ur-U, that's deeply rooted in Egyptian, ultimately soteriological theories, that is to say astrological salvation in both schemata and final destination up in stellar eternity. But if that's not enough for you, there are so many other sub-realms that get named in this text, like the pre-hyper-incomprehensible ones, the 5 incisions, here be Cenobites, and the hyper-unmoved ones, and that's just in the Books of Jeu, not to mention how all this manages to get so much more complicated in the Pistis Sophia, with its whole underworld featuring a kind of LDS, outer darkness, and then even a realm kind of above the 60 Treasuries of Light called the highest light world, because somehow we're now playing Final Fantasy 6309, because I have no idea what they're up to now. I think I stopped at Final Fantasy 6 with Kefka. And finally, I can't stress enough how I'm dramatically simplifying all of this to make it kind of all make sense. It's just overwhelmingly complicated, technical, and at times extremely precise. And this is actually why I would say that the Books of Jeu are Gnostic in a very strict sense. In fact, I'd even go so far as to call them hyper-Gnostic. It's not just some vague gnosis, some vague knowledge that the physical world is evil and your true nature is spiritual and you need to escape to that spiritual realm of Christ like you find in some other Gnostic texts. Oh no. No. This text is radically demanding in that it requires that you know both the layout of an incredibly complex cosmology, the beings that inhabit it, but the highly specific techniques down to the magical signs, the names of those beings, the specific cipher numbers, the protective seals, how many times you should use those words of power and their enunciation, and even the direction of the enunciations inside of the world of the treasuries for each and every ionic layer, sublayer, mist, and treasury. In the Books of Jeu, it isn't some vague philosophical truth that liberates you. It is hyper-detailed technical knowledge of the fundamental workings of each and every layer of reality that your soul has to transverse. Other Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of Truth, give off a kind of rosé drunk laughter and love and light. Those are the kind of vibes. After studying this book, meanwhile, the Books of Jeu is over there sitting in the dark with 6 shots of espresso given off like you're staring at a black Unix terminal of reality logged in as root. Like, you just barely cleared the 4th Aeon, guys. Don't mess this up. Jesus, what's the next cipher? Jesus, please tell me the next cipher. Yeah, those vibes. That's just to say I can't recommend it enough. I love the Books of Jeu. If you want to dive into this world, the worlds, the Aeons, the Treasuries of Light of Jungian Gnosticism, an amazing combination of ancient Ascent literature, Gnostic soteriology, and the ritual techniques which link it in so many ways to Greco-Egyptian magic, well, I have some bad news for you. Some of the most powerful archons in the academic publishing industry continue to make these texts and these volumes financially inaccessible to common, regular people making a normal wage in this world. The 2 major works in English, the McDermott translation of the text with the Facing Coptic and Aaron Evans Walker's wonderful study of the text, which this episode would have been impossible without, the Books of Jeu and the Pistis Sophia as Handbooks to Eternity, are both published by the real archons of our world, Brill, and together cost over $300 for 2 books. $300 for 2 books. The new and important critical edition of the text by Krieger isn't much more accessible at €138, and you'll need to be able to read it in French. Finally, if you read German, you can read the original Schmidt critical edition over at archive.org. Sadly, at this point, there are no other reliable, accessible translations of any of the literature around the Books of Jeu. I suspect that the Gnostic contents of the Bruce Codex and the Ascue Codex will continue to be underappreciated by academics, but also by a wider audience and a wider public, despite an outstanding interest in Gnosticism and ancient magic by just regular non-academics who are wanting to better themselves through education. This is another case where expensive academic publishing bars the door to providing information just by providing it to an elite few in the ivory tower of the academy who can afford them. But we'll come back to the Aeons when we dive into this complex world of the Pistis Sophia, when I work up the nerve to work through that text. But until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.